when Mr. Dannenbarger asked me to talk about the Gulag, I, of course, said yes, not having realized just what a complete downer this topic is, as you have probably been learning as you read the book. It's one unremitting tale of woe and misery. But we'll talk today about the Gulag. And last night, Mr. Dannenbarger sent me an email asking what I was doing in terms of audio-visual aids. Well, of course, I hadn't prepared any. So striking a blow against technology, I'm actually just going to turn off the lights and let you guys provide your own slideshow for a moment. All right, great. This is why I don't do PowerPoint. What are we doing here? There we go. Great. Okay, keep your hands off each other. Or if you are going to, do it quickly because the lights will go back on. So here's your slideshow. Let's just, the first slideshow is imagine the Soviet Union. You all have, if you've looked in the first couple of pages of the book, you've got a sense of just how big it is. The Soviet Union encompasses 12 time zones. 12 time zones. So it's immense. We have 3 time zones. So imagine that. And then imagine that most of it is very unpopulated. The whole eastern 3/4 of it is vast. It's flat, it's taiga, and as it goes up to the Arctic, it's freezing cold. Imagine the coldest day we had this winter, that's nothing. Up in the Siberian Arctic, the temperature has gone down to 70 degrees below freezing before. It is routinely 20, 30, 40 degrees below freezing. Think about just how cold that is. And then let's think, there's very few photos of the Gulag, which I actually did consider doing a slideshow, but there's not many photos. The people who ran the Gulag, which consisted at its height of 476 camp complexes, consisting of more than 2,000 individual camps. 26 million people passed through this collection of camps that was known as the Gulag. Well, they weren't all that thrilled about having people take photos of that. The Zeks, as they were called, the prisoners, didn't have their little Kodak cameras. There weren't iPhones in those days. They had very little to take with them. The prison guards weren't encouraged to take photos and send them home. So there's very few photos, but there are a couple, and you don't need to see them. You can imagine them right now. Just imagine millions of starving, thin, hungry, cold, ill-kept, desperate, unshaved, tired, overworked human beings doing impossibly difficult tasks in impossibly awful conditions. And I'm sure you can probably imagine that. And so we don't need to show pictures about that. That's the end of the lights out. That knocking sound you heard was how it usually began. It happened that way for our heroine in this book, Lena Vilkas. It starts with a knock in the middle of the night. Why do they come in the middle of the night? Well, you know, when the FBI has to arrest someone in this country, they often come around 4 in the morning, 3 in the morning, 5 in the morning. Imagine you go to bed, you're safe in your house, the heat is on, maybe you're sound asleep, maybe you're writing a letter like Lena was, and then there's a pounding on the door, maybe a crashing if they decide to break through the door. That's the way it worked. And on June 14th, 1941, which historically, accurately, this book begins, on June 14th, 1941, through June 18th, 1941, Soviet secret police called the NKVD more recently called the KGB. They're the ones who really ran the system. They knocked on the doors of 40,000 Lithuanians. Now that was just the beginning, the first 4 days of this. But they knocked on the door of 40,000 Lithuanians, people like Lena and her family. Now of course this was the last thing they would have expected. They were safe in their home, and that's why the NKVD would come then. And the next thing they knew, they were on a train heading east. And the train lasted a long time because Siberia is way far away. There's a railroad called the Trans-Siberian Railway. It runs today to Vladivostok on the Pacific coast. And it's about a 7,000-mile long railroad track. It takes 5 or 6 days to get out there now in 2014. So those old railroads and those days took forever. And then when you finally got there, as you're learning as you read this book, it was complete misery. Now, Lithuania was a very small part of the Soviet Union. Lithuania today is an independent country. It has been since, I guess, 1991. But back then it had been annexed and occupied by the Soviet Union around 1940, and it was not free for another 50 years until around 1990 when the Soviet Union fell apart. So for 50 years they were occupied. For 3 of those years they were occupied by the Nazis. The Soviet Union occupied Lithuania, and when Lena gets picked up in the middle of the night with her mom and her little brother, the Soviets were in charge. But certainly within months, the Nazis came in. And what the Nazis did was different. They didn't expel people like Lena and her family, but the Nazis, during their 3 years in charge of Lithuania, killed over 90% of the Jews of Lithuania. Over 200,000 Jews were killed, somewhere between 195,000 and 200,000 Jews. Most of the Jews of Lithuania were killed. Then the Soviets came back, took it over, and then for the next 46 years or so, laid a very heavy oppression on Lithuania. And by the time it was all over, in 1990-91, Lithuania had lost about 1/3 of their population. Estimates are hard to come by, but roughly 1.2 million Lithuanians were killed during their 50-year occupation by the Nazis and the Soviets. So it was not a happy time for the Lithuanians. And of course, June 14th, 1941, when Lena gets picked up, that is just the beginning. It's the beginning for her of this incredibly long journey. Most of the Lithuanians who were picked up in the 40s and exiled, those that did not die, and many did. There was 26 million people sent off to the gulags, not just from Lithuania, but from all over the Soviet Union. And of that 26 million, estimates vary from somewhere between 2 and 10 million dying. Realistically, it's probably somewhere by 2 to 3 million died. Most of the Lithuanians who survived did not come back until the mid-1950s. So I don't want to spoil the ending of this book, but if Lena manages to make it out of the gulags, she'll be more than likely in her early 30s when she gets back to Lithuania. So Mr. Dandenberger asked me to give you some background on the Gulag. That's a little bit on the background in Lithuania, but what I'm going to talk about in our brief time together today, I'm going to define the Gulag. I'm going to try to put it in some context, and then I'm going to briefly describe it. But let me start off by just asking a question and going back to that knock on the door. It's the middle of the night. I'm looking right now at a group of 18-year-olds, maybe a couple 19-year-olds, maybe some 17-year-olds, maybe some 20-year-olds, and ask you, what you would think if you wake up in the middle of the night, it's 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, and some jackbooted NKVD thugs break into your house and take your mother away in front of your eyes and take your little brother or your little sister away. What would you do? I'm not asking for anyone to answer. I wouldn't put anyone on the spot like that. But it happened to millions of people. It happened to hundreds and thousands, actually for certain, millions of families as well. And there is that moment in the middle of the night when someone comes to take you. Maybe in rare cases they'll take you at your office, but or they'll take you in the fields or anything else, but often it was in the middle of the night. And they'd put you in a truck and take you to a train and ship you off. And throughout, as I talk about this, and as you read the book, you might always ask yourself, what would I do? What would I do when confronted with such an overwhelming evil? We're not, I look around, I look at myself, we're nice suburban young people. Well, you guys are young, I'm old, but we're all kind of suburban, innocent people. We've never dealt with this kind of institutionalized violence in our life. But in the 20th century, millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of people died, whether it was from the Nazis, killing 6 million plus people, Mao Zedong in China, in one 4-year period, the Great Leap Forward, he was responsible for somewhere between 40 and 60 million deaths from famine. And then we have Joseph Stalin, who was in power through 1953, from roughly, say, 1930 to 1953, and he was responsible for easily 50 million people dying violently or from starvation. So what would you have done? Let's first define the Gulag. Gulag, what's Gulag mean? Gulag is a Russian word, and it means main camp administration. Main camp administration, as bland as that. And the camps started slowly, actually. The Tsar, the Russian Tsar, the leader, had started a few prison camps out in Siberia, but it really started to rev up when the communists took over in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, which was followed by the Russian Civil War, the USSR Civil War. Then there was World War II, and it soon became a huge administration, administering, as I say, over 476 complexes, thousands of camps, millions of people. At any given time, there would be 2 or 3 million people in these camps, which were spread over this vast distance of the Soviet Union. All 12 time zones of the Soviet Union had camps. So they were spread out all over these vast distances. This. So it took a lot of administration. What made the camp so interesting? You know, we are a country that incarcerates a lot of people. The United States incarcerates more people than any industrialized country in the world. We have something like 2 million prisoners incarcerated in this country. Some of them for murder, armed robbery, rape, some for possession of 4 ounces of marijuana or for minor crimes. But what makes our system different than the Soviet system was that in our country we put you in prison for what you do. For what you do. You commit a crime of some kind, and it's a crime against your fellow citizens, and you go to prison for a specified period of time. You may get out early with parole. What characterized the Gulag was that you were put in prison for who you were. You got put in prison if you were a member of the clergy. You got put in prison if you were a member of the military, if you were like a Polish military officer. When World War II began, the Polish military had over 10,000 officers. When the Polish were invaded by the Soviet Union, virtually every Polish officer was killed. Over 10,000 of them were taken to a place called the Katyn Forest, and they were killed at the rate of about 400 a day over a period of about a month. And they were just lined up on the edges of these big pits, shot once in the back of the head, and in they toppled. Now they blamed the Nazis for this, and the Nazis took the blame for about 30 years until the Soviet Union archives were opened, and they have since acknowledged that they were the ones who killed 10,000 Polish officers. So they killed clergy, they imprisoned business people who own businesses. If you were an educated college professor, a newspaper editor, a writer, an artist, you might be imprisoned. Lena's father was the provost of the university, so he was ripe for the picking. People like that. After the war, German POWs who had been taken prison by the Soviets were put into the Soviet Gulag. Most of them, many of them died. At least a quarter of the German POWs survived. In one case, there was a German huge division of 400,000 Germans taken prisoner. Only 60,000 survived. So that was 340,000 of them died. The ones who did survive, though, didn't get sent back to Germany mostly until the mid-1950s. So you're some young 18-year-old German, you're conscripted into the German army, you go to the Eastern Front, you're taken prisoner by the Russians, you then go to Siberia for 10 years of hard, cold labor. Soviet prisoners of war. If you were a Soviet prisoner of war taken prisoner by the Americans or by the Germans or by the English, you were considered suspects. So when you came back to the Soviet Union, you were put into the Gulag. If you had left the Soviet Union before World War II, there was an agreement at Yalta, a big conference during World War II. President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill were there, the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of England, and they agreed on a law of repatriation. Over 2 million Soviets were forcibly repatriated to the Soviet Union, and because they had left showing their disloyalty, they too ended up in the Gulag. The kulaks. The kulaks were the somewhat prosperous farmers. The Ukraine was full of them because the Ukraine really is the breadbasket of Central Europe. And so roughly when Stalin came to power, he was determined to rapidly industrialize the Soviet Union. So one thing he did was collectivized all the wonderfully successful, independently owned farms of the Ukraine. Those people were forced to either directly move off the land and get put on trains and go out to the Gulag, or they were forced to pay huge taxes in grain, more than they could even produce. So ultimately, a huge starvation occurred between 1931 and 1932. And in that starvation, between 5 and 7 million Ukrainians died of starvation. So you begin to see how the deaths add up in the Soviet Union. By the time World War II was over in 1945, over 50 million Soviets had died who otherwise might be alive if not for the Gulag, Second World War, First World War, the Civil War, and the Bolshevik Revolution. And it's only fair to say that the Soviet Union basically won World War II. The United States played a role. We lost 400,000 men fighting in World War II. The Soviet Union lost 26 million people defeating the Germans. So that made it really easy for us on the Western Front when the Soviets were killing Germans like crazy on the Western Front, but they lost 26 million people doing it, from war, from massacre by the Germans, from starvation, from just general awfulness. And this story is a story of just unremitting awfulness. You're reading this nice little book, you're getting a little picture of how bad Lena and her family has it. Hers was one story among millions. So, let's just see. So the kulaks, the clergy, business people, educated elite, military officers, Germans, Soviets, all those people into the meat grinder of the Gulag. Now, I want to just jump in here. I know we have some students here from Russia, and they hear me saying all this stuff about the Soviet Union. I'm trying to make sure I talk about the Soviet Union, because that's history. The Soviet Union went out of business around 1991. But the United States has had its bad moments too. So I'm trying to be accurate talking about the Gulag, but you know, living in America, if you had arrived in 1619 or 1620 with the Puritans at Jamestown or at Plymouth Rock, we weren't very nice to our indigenous Aboriginal people. We got rid of an awful lot of Indians, and the ones we still have, Native Americans, a lot of them are stuck on reservations in our equivalent of Siberia, which is called North Dakota and South Dakota and Oklahoma, where people can barely talk. So we've put Indians in reservations. And who are the poorest minority in the United States right now? American natives, Native American Aboriginal people. They're the poorest, the most afflicted with drug addiction and alcohol and crime and poverty and sickness of any people. And slavery was not exactly a walk in the park either. For 200 plus years, we dragged people from Africa, enslaving them, working them to death, and that has continued. That continued until we had our Civil War, which was by far on a percentage basis the most violent war in our history, 600,000 dead. And that was fought to end slavery, but it certainly didn't end persecution of our African immigrants. So the United States isn't perfect either. But today we're talking about the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, at its worst, was really bad. I would say pretty bad, but it was really bad. For reasons we'll continue to talk about. So because America, the United States, we're a democratic, free market world. The Soviet Union was not. It was not democratic. As a matter of fact, the Soviet Union, growing out of the experience of the Russian people, they have not really had, traditionally, historically, a democratic history. You know, they went from the czars to the commissars. And they went from a monarchy with 98% of their people living on the land as serfs, and a few at the top as business owners, millionaires, and royalty, to the Soviet system. So our systems are different, and our systems are at the root of a lot of what's going on here. So let's talk then about the purpose of the Gulag, as we define the Gulag. What was the Gulag created for? Well, one thing, it was to separate the opponents of the regime. Imagine if someone took power in our country and said, if you own an individual business, you have to hand it over to the state. If you have a successful farm, you are going to have it collectivized. We're going to stick all the farms in Iowa into one big collective farm, and you're just going to work for the collective. You no longer get to own your own farm. You don't get to own your own car. You don't get to own your own house. You don't get to worship what you want. We're closing all the churches. And that's what it was like. So a lot of people didn't like that. You're not going to be able to write about political leaders and tell them that they suck. You're not going to be allowed to write in the newspaper what you want to write. You're not going to be able to put on the radio what you want to listen to. We are taking away your economic rights. We're taking away your political rights. It wouldn't go over that well in the United States. From time to time, they have TV shows imagining what would happen and what brave young people would do if some dictator would take over. Well, that's what happened in the Soviet Union. So one of the very first tasks was to get rid of people who were going to give problems to the new regime. One solution was to shoot them, and a lot of them were shot. But another solution was to send them far away. And Siberia is far away. It's worse than North Dakota. It's worse than Mississippi. I mean, it's really bad. And that's pretty bad. So they sent them off to Siberia. They sent them off to the Arctic. They sent them way out to the Pacific, Kamchatka and places like that, really remote. No movie theaters, no multiplexes, no Hulu Plus, nothing. That was one thing. The second reason they sent them out there was to develop the economy. The Soviet Union, at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, Russia was a vast land, but it was not an industrialized country. They had lost a war to the Japanese in 1905. They did not have big factories. They weren't producing tons of steel, and nobody was buying goods stamped made in Russia, made in the Soviet Union. They still aren't, as a matter of fact, although they're buying an awful lot of oil and gas and minerals from Russia, and that comes from Siberia. So the leaders of the Soviet Union right away said, we need to send people out to the Soviet Union, to the Siberia, and mine all of our gold, mine our molybdenum, cut down our trees. We need to build railroads. We need to build roads. We need to build canals. We need to set up collective farms. We need to economically develop the Far East. Now, in our country, we settled our open lands very quickly because we're a free market economy. So all we had to do is give people an incentive. If you go west, young man, you'll get free land. If you go west and start to mine in Colorado, you'll get rich. And Americans, because of our human nature, because we're humans, and given a free market economy and given a democracy, we didn't have to be told to go west. People wanted to go west. They wanted to go make money. They wanted to have a new life. The Soviet Union might have said, there's phenomenal opportunities in Siberia. Go on out there and make your fortune. But that's not the way their system worked. Their system worked by sending people out there, and they sent millions of people into the gulags. They sent millions of people into forced exile. They said, you have to go to little East Bumscratch out there near Yakutsk, and you're going to work in this little village, and you're going to start to grow sugar beets. And these poor guys would say, okay, and maybe they'd live, but they never got to come back. They never got to come back to Moscow or Kiev or wherever they had come from. They said goodbye to their families if they, if they were single, or if they maybe went out with their spouse and their children, but they never saw their grandparents again or their uncles or aunts. They were done. They went to exile. So the second reason was economic. The gulag was set up. They didn't just go out there and hang out in the gulag. They worked. They cut down trees. They went into the Kolyma gold mines, where every year in the Kolyma gold mines, 30% of the zeks died. Imagine that. Every year you'd start the year saying, okay, there is a 7 in 10 chance I'll survive this year. There's a 3 in 10 chance I won't. So the 10 guys you went down to the mine with every day, at the end of the year only 7 of you would be around, year after year after year. But the camps produced 70% of the gold in Russia. That's how they did it. They worked them really hard. The third thing that the Gulag was designed to do, the first one being get dissidents, get troublemakers away from everybody else. So this Sovietization of the economy and of the life could take place. 2, economically develop the Siberia. 3, to sow terror. Because if you live in Lithuania, if you're from Vilnius, Lithuania, and your next door neighbor got the knock in the night, and you get up the next morning and all of a sudden your next door neighbors are gone and their house is empty, and then a week later a nice Russian family has moved in, and I think there's still a lot of Russians living in Lithuania from that period, then you thought twice before you said something bad about beloved leader Joseph Stalin. You thought twice before stopping applauding when some Soviet functionary comes to town. You don't want to be the first one who stops applauding after his speech. You are afraid, because as much as you may have liked your neighbor, you like living in your own house a lot more. So those were all reasons for the Gulag. So let's put the Gulag in context, because we have to get cracking here. I told you already that the USSR, huge, 12 time zones, absolute rule, no democracy. They went from one czar to the other. Some were pretty nice, some were pretty bad. Being called Ivan the Terrible, not a good sign. That's a sign that he did a lot of bad things, and he really did. He was certainly not a bowl full of candy. This took place in the context of a bloody 20th century. World War I was catastrophic for the Russians. It in fact is kind of what World War I went from 14 to 18. The Soviets kind of pulled out of it because they took time for their revolution in 1917. Following that, the White Russians, which were the Russians who owned land, had businesses, were nobles, who didn't want the Reds to take over, the communists, they had a civil war. Around 9 or 10 million Russians died during the Civil War. Following that was the collectivization. 5 to 7 million Ukrainians alone died of starvation. There had also been 1 million or 2 million killed in the 20s from starvation during the Civil War. Then comes World War II, 26 million dead from the Soviets and from the Russians. There was no retreat if you were in the Soviet army. You know, there was the guys fighting the Germans, and then there was the guys behind their soldiers killing them if they tried to retreat. You know, the city of Leningrad, I think, was sieged for 900 days. They lost like 2/3 of their population, but they did not retreat. It's an inspiring story. It's an inspiring story. The the Soviet Union squashed Germany in World War II. They just, they did it, both sides were savage. It was a complete fracture of civilization. The rules of civilization as we suburban, nice young people think of them were not anywhere. It was just savagery. Millions, millions, millions died. So, and of course, so the Gulag grew out of this totalitarian transformation. And they did not invent, the Russians did not invent, this is another part of the context, the Russians did not invent concentration camps. Concentration camps, when you concentrate people for who they are, to separate them from other people. Spain did it back in the what we call the Spanish-American War, or the 10-year war from 1868 to 1878. In the U.S.-Philippine War, we put Filipinos in concentration camps because we didn't want the guerrilla fighters of the Philippines getting sustenance from their families, so we put their families in concentration camps. They first became concentration camps by name during the Second Boer War. The English, civilized English, put the Boers, who were the European inhabitants of South Africa, they were fighting a guerrilla war against the English. They put their wives and children into concentration camps. 26,000 of them died, mostly from starvation and diseases like typhus. So it really created a huge scandal at the time. But the English did set up the first concentration camps. We in our country interned Japanese Americans during World War II. We put them in concentration camps in very inhospitable places, like Montana and Wyoming and Idaho, and maybe even North Dakota, I don't remember. And exile's not new either. You know, the British exiled their prisoners to Australia. That's why we have Australia today. Before the prisoners got there, nobody lived there except Aboriginal people. And the French exiled people to French Guiana, people like Papillon and others. And they went some to Devil's Island. They've made a lot of good books and movies about that. The Nazis, of course, had spectacular concentration camps. They used them to kill Jews. They used them to kill gypsies. They used them to kill gay or homosexual people. They used them to kill people who had physical or mental disabilities. And they killed about 6 million people in their concentration camps. Which raises a question. How many of you knew about the Gulag before you started to read this book? Just if you don't mind raising your hand. How many people of you knew about it? Quite a few of you did. How many knew about the Holocaust? Yeah, I mean, who doesn't know about the Holocaust? It's very well known. I mean, there's been great movies made about it. Schindler's List, you know, won a ton of Oscars. It's very well known in Hollywood. Literature, The Diary of Anne Frank. Whereas the Gulag is not well known. Although, frankly, the Gulag and the Soviet Union killed a lot more people than 6 million. The Nazis really only did about 6 years of killing. And it was mostly concentrated with the killing of the Jews and the gypsies and these other minorities. Whereas the Soviet Union did it for really powerfully, they did it for about 25 years when Joseph Stalin was the president of Russia. Why not? Because Germany was conquered and their books were open. American soldiers and Soviet soldiers went into the camps. They took pictures. That didn't happen with the Soviet Union. They went on for decades. They were never conquered. No one ever went in and said, oh, we're going to take lots of pictures and show the world how awful these were. The news of the gulags has come out very slowly. They really didn't get well known until a guy named Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote a book about it. And the book was first A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, who was a typical Czech, and then he wrote a book called the Gulag Archipelago. So let me just quickly describe the camps. You're getting a picture of them far better than I can give you from your book. From your book, Between Shades of Gray, Lena writes about just how awful the whole thing is. A pregnant woman has a baby, and then they bring her out within hours of giving birth. The baby dies in the first 3 days. They drop the baby through the latrine hole in the train. It's just one awful thing after another. The camps, the Czechs, the prisoners, they lacked everything. They did not have much food. The more they produced, the more food they got. But even if they were really productive, they didn't get much. But if they produced less than their quota, they got less food, which of course is a real catch-22. The less productive you are, the less food you get. The less food you get, the weaker you are, the less you can produce. The camps were incredibly Kafkaesque. They were inefficient. They didn't make sense. They were arbitrary. The rules were kind of crazy. But food was a huge issue for all the Soviets. Matter of fact, people in the Gulag used to talk about the outer Gulag. They said in the Soviet Union there were two Gulags. The outer Gulag, which is everyone else in Russia just living their typical lives. And then there was the people actually in the Gulag. They didn't have enough food. They didn't have warm clothing. Partly just because of inefficiency. People would be picked up in the summer in the clothes they had. By the time the train got to where they were going and they got to their final site, someplace where there might not even be a road, well, it was already fall or winter. And there they were with their summer clothes. They might promptly freeze to death, or as other people died, they'd start to wear other people's clothes. The prisons were incredibly overcrowded. There are some pictures of what they looked like. Little shacks with lots of people put into them. No health care, terrible hygiene. Everyone had lice. Everyone got diseases. There were very few doctors. You were just dirty all the time. The housing was terrible. It wasn't well insulated, so you had to do hard labor from what they say is can't see to can't see. That's what they say up in North Dakota anyway. You work from dark till dark all day long. If you fall, you were pretty much out of luck. You had to just keep working. And of course there's violence. Prisons are violent. Sexual violence, physical violence, there's informers. It was just tough. As I said, in the Kolyma gold fields, people died. 30% of the prisoners died every year, just turning them over. The White Sea-Baltic Canal was one of their first projects, built in the 1920s. There was 125,000 workers, 25,000 of them died, but the Soviet leaders loved to go there and show off to the Europeans, see what workers can do. They said it, reforging class enemies through collective effort. They always had these great slogans, just like refortifying class enemies. They tried to, they just want everyone to buy into this this kind of utopian thing that, yes, we're sacrificing, but it's all going to be worth it. It's going to be a utopian workers' paradise where everyone's going to be equal and everyone's going to have lots to eat and it's all going to be wonderful. So they built this canal. They built it in record time, killed tons of the workers. Like 1 out of every 5 died. And when it was all over, it was too shallow. It's still there, it's used for pleasure boats, but it was built for ocean-going ships to go from the White Sea down to the Baltic Sea. Not a single ocean-going ship has ever been able to use it. They built it too shallow. So that's just a touch of the, so that's a touch of the Gulag. Oh, that's slow. Oh, so I better get right to questions. So the fact is, totalitarianism is a frightening thing. I teach economics. I believe in free markets. I believe in democracy. Joseph Stalin did not. The Soviet Union did not. Ultimately, it fell apart of its own design. Totalitarianism often brings out the worst in people. You look out for yourself. You care more about yourself than your neighbor. If your neighbor does get in trouble, you pray, there but for the grace of God go I. Or you say, well, they must have done something wrong to have been picked up. It teaches you never to be the first one to stop applauding. We can always count on bad people doing bad things. There's bad people in the world. They do bad things. But in a totalitarian regime, the good people do bad things. The good people do bad things thinking somehow they're doing something right. And that's what happened here. So we have a couple minutes if anyone has a question. I'm glad to answer it. And if you don't, that's okay. Yes, Emily. A Zek. A Zek, Z-E-K, a Zek is a prisoner. It may be a Russian word, I don't know. Does anyone here? It is a Russian word. What's it mean, Diana? Prisoner. So a prisoner is a Zek. And in 45 minutes, they had their own culture in the camps, of course. Yes?
I did want to say something about the difference between Russia and the Soviet Union.
Yes.
I know many people who lived in the Soviet Union and Lithuania, who were in Siberia. None of them has any negative feelings for Russians. They know that the Soviet Union is one thing, Russia is another thing. We have another history with Russia, but that was before this. But for this event, the Russians were as much victims as other people were. Just so we're clear about this.
Yeah, and I double that. I don't want to offend any of my students. I do that enough in class with my Russian student who I'm looking at the moment. I say sometimes bad things, but I don't mean them much. So any other questions about anything to do with this? Are we out of time now?
There's 1 minute.
Any student question at all just to make me... No? Say it again. We do, but a very short one because I'm... Come to class, yes, and I'll tell you when we get there. It'll be short, though. All right, see you.